land since time immemorial. Today, we uphold our ongoing responsibility to work together in the spirit of the intent of the treaties with all the First Peoples and nations that call this place home. The town expresses gratitude for the opportunity to build a better community on these sacred lands for generations to come. And with that, I'd like to call this meeting to order at 4 p.m. Council, any additions or deletions to today's agenda? Seeing none. Administration.
There is nothing from administration.
Thank you, CEO Panasic. With that, I'll entertain a motion, Council. Councillor Stashik.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to move that council adopt the agenda for today's regular meeting of council as presented.
Thank you, Councillor Stashik. Council, we have a motion on the floor. Any debate? Seeing none, we will go to our voting. Councillor Taylor. Are you signed in, Councillor Taylor? Okay, we will vote. Yeah, if we can acknowledge that. Oh, you are there. That is carried unanimously. That'll bring us to our council minutes for adoption. Any questions? If not, I'll entertain a motion, Council. Councillor Haas.
I'd like to move that we adopt the regular council minutes for April 4th, 2023. And I'm going to separate them because then we have two different motions, I'm assuming, right? No? Okay. And I'll also move that we adopt the committee of the whole April 11th, 2023 minutes, please.
Thank you, Councillor Haas. Council, we have a motion on the floor. Any debate? Seeing none, we will go to voting. And that is carried unanimously. That will bring us to our citizens minute with council. This is your opportunity to come forward. Just please state your name, share your concerns with council.
Good afternoon. I'm Vanessa LaFleur. I'm the homelessness coordinator at HELP. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for the chance to speak about our homelessness issues. We strongly feel that you should accept and support the resolution put forth by Alberta municipalities regarding homelessness and associated social needs in rural communities. HELP has been providing supports for homelessness in Hinton since 2019. With little financial support from the town of Hinton. During this time, we have supported hundreds of people, thousands of times. For example, since July 1st, 2022, 83 different homeless people used Freddie's resource room 185 times. 164 different people used our day space 664 times. We have provided 1,130 meals, along with 1,537 different supports, referrals for those clients. Our operating costs are rising. We need a place where our homeless clients can live, where there is an understanding of their needs, along with on-site support services. We are willing to continue to take this on as an organization. However, our federal funding will be running out as of March 31st, 2024. And should we be unable to find funding, our homelessness population in Hinton will once again be left with minimal supports, and our other support agencies will see a large increase in their client base, which is not fair to them. We strongly encourage the town of Hinton to support the resolution put forth to you today to help contribute to supporting the growing number of homeless individuals in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for what HELP does. And we look forward to that conference where we have that opportunity to support that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else with council? Seeing none, that'll bring us to our action items for this afternoon. First one is 6.1, 2022 audited financial statements. CEO Panasic.
Thank you, Mayor, to the rest of council. I don't have much to add, but as you know, following Section 276 of the Municipal Government Act, we are responsible to pass audited financial statements yearly. Here to speak to the audited financials as presented is our auditor, Edward Telford. So I will turn this over to Edward to take council through them.
Thank you, CEO Panasic. Welcome, Edward.
Thank you. Good to be here. Again, I'm Ed with JDP Wasserman. My son goes by Eddie. My dad goes by Ed. So I try to go to Edward at times to lessen the confusion. That is just fine. I'm here to go over two documents. If you remember this time, well, not quite this time last year, it's great to be here in April so we can have everything finalized before the May 1 deadline. As we talked about last year at our meeting, there's a letter that's required by every auditor at the end of every audit to write to those charged with governance. So in the terms of the town, municipality, it's council. This would go to the board of a not-for-profit. This would go to the owner of a small business. It's required under every audit for those charged with governance. If there's anything of significance that we find that we think rises to the level that we should be reporting it to you directly, it goes in this letter. So you'll see a lot of the headings as we go through the letter talk about significant items. Whether or not we found anything, we have to address whether or not there was anything to report. So each of these headings is going to be in this letter each and every year. The long and short of it is the audit process was much improved this year as opposed to last, obviously being here in April. The year end was much more well prepared. So thank you to Alicia and Shelby for that. Obviously with the staff turnover the town has experienced that you're well aware of. Last year was a challenge, especially being our first year as external auditors. So as I often tell all of our clients, it's usually a 3-year process to the point where we get to a completely clean audit. So we're in year 2 of that. So again, definitely some improvements. There is also a separate letter that we write to management, which contains recommendations that we don't feel rises to the level that it would be in the letter directly to council, that we would report directly to council. So we do have recommendations. A lot of them are the same as the prior year, just with the new staff being installed mid-year. And when we finally closed the 2021 fiscal year off, it probably wasn't realistic that a lot of those recommendations were going to be able to be put into place in time for this year's audit. So it's something we look forward to having cleared up again in that 3rd year. So you'll see in this letter, it talks about significant risks. So every audit, we're required to focus on areas that have a higher level of risk. That's where we focus our audit procedures and most of our attention. So it talks about our response to where we feel there can be a higher level of risk. We talk about any significant difficulties encountered. So similar to last year's audit, there was a difference in accumulated surplus that we were required to find, but it was a much lower dollar value this year compared to last at 200,000 versus 2 million in the prior year. So again, improvements, but the same kind of recommendations as we had last year. Accounting policies and accounting estimates. So if we have any disagreements with management's choice of how they're accounting for things and the accounting policies they're using, we're required to report that. So there was nothing of concern there. Significant consolidated financial statement disclosures. So when we go through the financial statements themselves, we'll go through some of the main notes and schedules that we always look at. But if there was anything of significance that we would want to point to your attention in this letter to say kind of, hey, when you're looking at the financial statements, make sure you make note of this. There's nothing of that kind of significance, but we will go through, like I say, some of the main notes and schedules when we look at the financials themselves. Uncorrected misstatements refers to any errors that we find that management, for whatever reason, does not want to correct. So they could have to do with prior years. That's usually what happens, is that a revenue or an expense ends up in one fiscal year, but it should have technically been in another. So there was nothing of that nature. Every adjustment that we proposed, for example, to adjust the difference in accumulated surplus, the 200,000, everything that we proposed was accepted and recorded by management. So no issues there. Significant deficiencies in internal control. This is where you'll see in the second paragraph here, we make note that this other letter to management exists. So we want to be transparent in that we're notifying council directly in this letter that this other letter does exist. If you want to see it, you absolutely can request it from management. They can provide it to you. Again, it's more lighter recommendations on areas that there can be improvements. But again, doesn't rise to the level that we think council should absolutely know about this, in which case it would be in this letter. Written representations. So there is a letter that management needs to sign that every auditor requires in every audit, basically putting in writing, attesting to the fact that they've given us all the information that we've requested from them. They're not withholding anything from us. We just require that in writing. So that's what that speaks of, just so council's aware that that letter exists. And then lastly, we just confirm our independence to the town in writing, allowing us to act as your external auditors. So again, thank you to Alicia, to Shelby. Definitely improvements this year, and we look forward to what we hope is greater improvement next year as well. But nothing, like I say, that rises to the level of a significant issue that we would put in this letter to bring to council's attention specifically. Any questions on that?
Thank you, Mr. Telford. Council, Councillor Taylor.
Yeah, the accumulated surplus of
Sorry, do I have to press this button?
No, you're good.
the accumulated surplus of 1.8 million, the swing there. Can you explain that? I assume that's the accumulated surplus is the
On the financial
number
statements, you
on
mean?
page 6 table, the table there. So what swung 1.8 million that caused you to reconciliate?
Are you looking at page 6 of the letters? No, the financial statements.
Yeah, I'm talking about your letter, significant difficulties encountered. And you mentioned that you had to reconcile.
Right, yes, the
accumulated
200,000.
surplus. And I'm asking for a little more detail on that.
So basically, how the financial statements flow is you have last year's accumulated surplus, which is the sum of all your income statements, all your revenues and expenses from the beginning of time up until that year end. That number carries forward to next year as your opening balance. You add that current year's revenue and expenses, the bottom line, add that to the opening accumulated surplus, and that's your ending accumulated surplus. In the midst of making all of the entries in the software to record all of the transactions for the year, if one by mistake gets posted directly to accumulated surplus instead of flowing through as a revenue and expense in the year, it throws it out of balance, because basically what you're doing is you're adjusting the opening number. So now your financial statements can't balance because the opening number has changed. So then we have to go through all of the transactions that are within accumulated surplus, which could include things like reserve transfers would be the most common. We have to go through all of the transactions and find out which ones weren't supposed to go here. Then once we identify however many transactions those are, we have to figure out what's the fix for each of them to bring those revenues and expenses correctly into the current year so that it continues to flow properly, where opening plus this year's bottom line equals ending. Does that make sense? It's not an issue of something like there's money missing or something of a fraud concern or anything like that. It's simply the way the accounting works. Something has been posted to a place where it shouldn't be, and we just got to move it to the right place.
Yeah. Yes.
But it's always an issue because like I talked about last year when it was out by 2 million. 2 million is a big number, but you don't know if you're out by 2 million until you investigate it, because you could be out one way by 12 million and you could be out the other way by 10 million. And you got to find both pieces of those. The net is 2 million. We always know how much we're out in net, but until we dig into the transactions, we never know. So some clients, we show up and they're only out, $25,000. And they'll say to us, well, can we just write that off? Let's just put that to other revenue. And we'll say, well, no, because you might be out, $1 million this way, right? And then 25 grand this way, and the net, right, is 25,000. So we always have to investigate it. It can take time depending on how many transactions there are. So it can be a bit of a chore, but it was a lot simpler this year than last year. So not as big of a concern, but again, something that it has to be fixed. Otherwise your statements don't balance properly.
Thanks for helping me understand.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Council, any other questions regarding this? Seeing none, Mr. Telford, you can continue.
Perfect. So moving on to the financial statements. We have a clean audit opinion. Two main schedules we always look at. I guess firstly, let's look at changes that will be coming to these drafts that have come to light in the last couple days. So nothing of great significance. This is probably the more significant one. With all of the changes in CAOs over the last couple of years, note 12, we have an additional amount to add under CAO for contracted payment out. So this note says salaries and benefits, but basically if your CAOs are contracted or on salary, it doesn't matter. We have to report any contracted payments as well. So there is a significant amount to add for one of the CAO positions in the midst of all the turnover. I believe, Shelby, it was 180,000 and change. Correct me if I'm wrong. So that will change the total amount of your current year. So there'll be a significant amount above the prior year, which is 2021 here. So it was one payment that was missed for a contractor amount that we identified, just like I say, in the last couple of days after these drafts were done up. So that will be a change to this note. If you do so choose to request we call it a management letter from management, which is where we talk about our lighter housekeeping type recommendations. A point we had last year, which we carried forward to this year, was not uncommon when you've got staff turnover. Municipalities can get behind on their grant submissions. So there's a thing called an SFE that gets submitted every year to the province saying under the grant programs for MSI, MSP, federal gas tax, here's the amount of our allocation for the year. Here's how much we spent in the year that we're claiming grant funds on. So if you don't put these SFEs and these project applications in, the province doesn't release any of your funds for your annual allocations until such time as you submit those documents. So the town was behind in receiving its money from the province for some of these grant programs. A lot of that has been rectified where, for example, there was over $2 million received from federal gas after year end that was owed to the town for multiple prior years. So that's being cleaned up. But the key takeaway for here and what could change to this note is if you get behind in those filings and you're approving audited financials every year, and then you're doing these filings later, sometimes there's a disconnect on what's being reported under which grant program. So that's something Alicia's inherited and has been working on catching up for those previous years. I think in the case of federal gas, it was 3 years behind. Getting those cleaned up. But we may have in reconciling all those prior year grant applications and SFE submitted to the province, the total of the deferred revenue, so the 2.155 isn't going to change, but the amount that was claimed under each grant program may change. So for example, I think the main change we're looking at, because the MSP program has now expired, the applications that were put in has eligible costs to be able to clear that. So instead of having 173 showing as a carry forward into 2023, it would show as 0, which is what we want, because that, again, that program has expired. So anything that's left will have to be paid out. So going back to those prior project applications and reconciling that amount and making sure that we're claiming MSP instead of MSI capital, for example. If we were approved under MSP, we might as well claim it because it's expiring. So the total isn't going to change. Like I say, just the composition of those numbers.
So before you move on, Mr. Telford, I do have a question by Councillor LaBerge.
Thank you. And it's to step back to, I think, note 5, the change in the note for the CAO compensation. Was that amount recognized on the, well, I call it profit and loss.
Yeah.
Do that.
Yes.
That it was in there. So it's not going to reduce the surplus. So
No.
it was recognized,
No.
just not noted in the note.
It will just only be included in that note. Yeah, nothing else changes.
The floor is back to you.
The last thing is the landfill. So these are the summarized financial statements of the landfill that go in your statements every year. And basically 20%, now that there's 5 members, used to be 25%. 20% of these numbers get included everywhere in your financial statements here. So for your income statement, your balance sheet, which we'll go over after this, your bottom line. So there was some confusion now with the switch in administration from one municipality to the other over who was responsible for preparing the year end for audits. So to date, we have still not been provided with a year end for which to audit. So we're working with both municipalities to basically take the time that the town was responsible in recording transactions for the landfill, adding in for the time that the county was recording the transactions for the landfill, adding those together and coming up with a balance sheet, an income statement. These numbers are from a very preliminary report that we received from the county, and they will change, which means the numbers in your financial statements essentially will change. So we're left with 2 options, because I'm assuming we don't want to be filing late again. Our position is the 20% that gets consolidated in is not material to your financial statements. So if we record based on these preliminary numbers, whatever the final numbers end up being, the difference between what we recorded at 20% and then what the actuals are at 20%, that difference at that 20% level is extremely immaterial. And so we are comfortable giving a clean audit opinion with these numbers as they stand, even though we know they're not 100% correct. But that's up to the discretion of council as well. If council prefers to have audited figures that back up this summarized financial statement in this note that got consolidated into your financial statements, then we would have to delay the approval of your financial statements. The option that I say we're comfortable with, because it's immaterial, we record as is, as shown in this note, and then the difference that we identify once we finish the landfill audit will just run through 2023. Right? So is it going to be $500,000? No. Could it be $50,000? Yes. So there could be a difference on 2023's financial statements of about that amount that we would run through 2023. But this is the only option that provides us the ability to file before May 1st, the town's financial statements. Does that make sense?
I have Councillor Taylor.
2 questions, the same one almost for Brian that Councillor Labarge had. This stuff you're talking about, how's that going to change what's reported right now in this financial report as unrestricted surplus? Will it change that?
It would change different parts of your accumulated surplus. So the unrestricted is one portion of it. And we go through that note in detail. I always like to look at that note while we're going over the financials. But like I say, if the difference ends up being, let's say it's $50,000 on your bottom line, we run that through 2023. Yes, technically that should have been in 2022. So your bottom line should have been $50,000 different than what we're showing on these financial statements. It could turn out that it's exactly the same or very, very close, and it's a $5,000 difference or something like that. But we don't, there's no way it's ever going to be material to the town's financial statements where we as auditors would say, we have to fix this before we can give you a clean audit opinion because it's material. In this case, it's not material because you're only reporting 20% your share of the landfill transactions. So because it's not material, we're comfortable running a minor difference, what we would consider a minor difference through 2023. But yes, it would mean that if we waited to finish the audit on the landfill, your 2022 surplus would be different by whatever amount that we've found.
So what I understood you to say, if I can say it back so I can understand it, is that if we finish the report with the preliminary numbers that are in it now, that unrestricted surplus, the other numbers won't change. And then if there are any changes, they will come forward into 2023.
Correct. There'll be no changes to 2022. We will just run the difference through 2023. And then when we're looking at that letter earlier, where I talked about errors that sometimes relate to prior years, for 2023, then we would report to you, and here's the dollar amount of the error that we found once we figured out the landfill and what the 2022 numbers should have been. But we're not going to change the 2022 numbers.
And we know that those changes will be insignificant enough for 2023 that it's not going to affect that year too much.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, the second question. The Waste Authority, of which I'm a board member, I think they're want some financial information soon. So you're aware of that, I guess.
Yes. So we reached out to the county when they had taken over the records to confirm that we would still be doing the audit. We intimated our timelines, being that we were going to be at the town doing their audit in late March. And so once we kind of saw the town's side of it, then we'd be in touch in late March to get the county's information and their year end in order to complete the audit by the 18th was the plan. So we reached out in late March, and there wasn't really a year end to audit yet. So, and like I say, to date, we haven't received anything. So we've got some reports. We're going through it, trying to put together a year end of here is all our balances, because just like the town, the landfill has assets of cash and investments and receivables to report. It has liabilities of just regular invoices, for December that get paid in January, and the landfill closure, post-closure liability. It's got its own assets, liabilities, revenues, and expenses. So that needs to be put together so that it can be audited. So we're working with, like I say, both parties to put that together, while at the same time recognizing that, I think we talked about this a little bit last year during our meeting, where in our role as auditors, we can provide recommendations. We can help out with technical accounting issues, such as the accumulated surplus difference we talked about, but we can't prepare a year end. We can't audit our own work. So it's not like we can just take reports for both parties, put it together ourselves, audit it ourselves, and then say, okay, here it is. Management has to put something together for us so we can help out in certain areas, but we can't just prepare a year end for our clients. So we're working as closely as we can to help out with the technical accounting areas and get numbers together so that an audit can be performed, but we're not there yet.
Anything further, Councillor Taylor?
In the future, we won't have this trouble because the financial statements for the Waste Authority will be more separate than the financial statements for us, because they're their own corporate entity.
So for years before our time as auditors, I understand the town had all of the transactions for the landfill running through the town's books, which is not ideal. So we always recommend, number one, try to become a commission so that you can have a separate board. You can debenture yourself if you need to. The members might have to kick in some money at the beginning, but after that, it'll get repaid, and then it goes along as a separate legal entity. If that's not the case, and you're dealing with an authority with multiple members, we still recommend that whoever is administrating it use a separate bank account and a separate accounting file. So you can use the same software that you use, say, for your town's accounting, but just have a separate file. So all the transactions are separate and it's got its separate bank account. Because when you commingle town receivables with landfill receivables on the same system, the same accounting file, it can get really messy and complicated really quick. So that is something that KPMG recommended for years, and the town ultimately got there. I think a year before we did our first audit. So that's the ideal situation. The county is not doing that. They're doing it the way the town used to. So I would be hesitant to say, in my experience, whenever an entity does it that way, I would always be hesitant to say that it's going to be clean moving forward, because I would be recommending to them, and I will be recommending to them, separate it out like the town had, separate bank account, separate accounting file. I don't care if you want to use Simply Accounting for the authority, and you can use your Muniware or Diamond or whatever for your municipality, but separate it out with a separate bank account because it makes everything easier. But I would anticipate that next year would be better than this year, because this year you've got the added wrinkle of two municipalities were responsible for part of the year, probably in hindsight. And if we were asked our opinion, we would have said, cut it off at December 31 at year end. Don't cut it off in August. That's going to make it messier. But it was cut off in August. I can't speak to the interactions between the two municipalities and then the board on that decision, but at least that part of the complication won't be there next year. So I would hesitate to say it's going to be perfectly clean, but I'd be confident in saying it's going to be cleaner than this year, where we're probably not going to finish that audit until sometime in May is my guess.
Thank you.
Whereas in most years, for an entity that size, I would expect them to be ready to have their audit completed by, middle of March, end of March.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Councillor LaBerge.
Thanks. The question to administration, I guess, with the landfill closure liability, that's 615,000, 16,000. Do we have a reserve sitting there to do that, or is that a unfunded liability?
Through the mayor and council, that is a funded liability. But I will turn it over to Ms. Borbeau if there's anything else to add on that.
Thank you, Council. As Mr. Telford goes through the rest of the financial statements, you will see a reserve schedule, and there are two West Yellowhead Regional Landfill Authority lines.
Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Telford.
I can speak to that as well. So how the financial statements work is, previously you weren't required to report a liability for these future costs on your books. And so it was incumbent upon each authority and commission on their own to build up a reserve to fund it. And they would do their own calculation, but it wasn't an audited number on their statements anywhere. And that, of course, created problems, because if it was a bad estimate, they wouldn't have the money. Or if they said, we don't want to raise rates, then the reserve doesn't build up, they wouldn't have the money. So it caused a huge issue. So then they changed the accounting standards to say, you have to record this liability on your books as a liability estimate of, in today's dollars, if I invest that money in the future, how much are you going to need in today's dollars to fund those future costs? And what that did was it forced them to put a liability on the books, meaning they didn't have to have a reserve anymore, because their net financial assets, for example, if you look at, easier to look at the schedule. Your net financial assets is already net of that number. So it takes your financial assets, it minuses your liabilities, and it has your net financial assets. And the liability is already deducted from it. So that's your 20% portion. So that means that you've got the money to fund it. You don't need a reserve, because if you didn't have the money to fund it, this number would be negative and this number would be negative, your accumulated surplus. So that was the trigger. When the province got your financial statements, once you finally put that liability on your books and those numbers were negative, they said, you better raise rates because you don't have enough money to fund this liability. So long story short, once you've got the liability on your books, as long as those numbers are positive, which it is in both the landfill and the town, you've got enough money to fund it. It doesn't have to come out of reserve. The money's already sitting there in assets, cash, investments, receivables, stuff that's cash or near cash, to be able to pay out that liability. There are some commissions and authorities that no matter what, they want a reserve to fund that. But when they build up a reserve to fund that number, they're essentially funding it twice. So the liability is already on the books. It's already covered. If the landfill were to dissolve and the town got 20% of the money from the landfill, it could pay its 20% of the closure post-closure at that time. So it doesn't impact reserves or accumulated surplus at all. One of the few times an accounting change actually made sense and was a good thing to do. Any other questions before I move on?
Nothing at this time.
Okay. So the main two statements we always look at. The first and most important is on page 6 here. These are your revenues, expenses, bottom line, results for the 12 months. So we've got budget in the first column, bold, actuals in the middle there, and then we're required to show prior year comparatives. So like we talked about last year, and we tell all of our clients, this is the important number. Your bottom line is here. So when I talked about opening accumulated surplus, which is ending of last year, so ending becomes opening, add your bottom line. That's your ending for this year. This is your actual bottom line. But it's impacted by this stuff. This stuff almost always, and in your case, everything except for this, which is a pretty small number in comparison of total 3.3 in this section. All of this 99% of the time relates to the part of your accumulated surplus known as equity intangible capital assets. So when we go through this accumulated surplus note, you'll see the different components that make it up. But the big part of it is what is invested in your capital assets. So think of it like equity in a house. It's the book value of your assets minus the related debt on those assets. That's your equity in capital assets figure. All of these revenues and expenses. Sorry, these revenues, there is no expenses in this case for this year. All these revenues, as well as the expenses, which are amortization, which are captured within each applicable function. Unfortunately, they make us put amortization up here. But all of these revenues and amortization expense flow into that separate fund. And that fund's completely illiquid because the assets that are offsetting against that fund are your capital assets. So you're never going to sell your roads and your buildings and everything else. It's never going to be cash. It's not like it's a reserve that's sitting there that can be used. So because all of these numbers flow into that fund, we always want to look at our surplus before that. So we always say, look at this number as a better idea of what your operating bottom line is. Again, though, with amortization captured in the expenses. When we're thinking about these numbers, we always say, this is involved with your capital assets. You're better off to look at your long-term capital plan, see what your future needs are, and make sure that you got funding sources to be able to pay for them in the future. So you're building up your reserves. You've got anticipated grants, whether it's your annual MSI or federal gas, or it's a one-time STIP grant or something of that nature. As long as you've got funding sources that are going to pay for your future capital expenditures, don't be worried so much about how amortization is impacting your bottom line or how much you're funding of your amortization, as long as those future cash in and outflows make sense. If you find that you're not having the funding sources anticipated to fund your future capital needs, that's the trigger to start saying, okay, do we need to increase taxes to build up reserves at a higher rate? We always tell our clients, don't make that decision on taxes purely by how much amortization you're funding each year, because amortization is just an estimate. And in municipalities' cases, tangible capital assets have only existed in your financial statements since 2008. So a lot of estimates were used in 2008 to bring the cost of these assets onto your books. Exactly how correct that estimate is, we'd like to think that it's perfect, but we know it's not. So if you're using that as a trigger to say, you know, how much amortization are we funding in terms of do we need to raise taxes? It's not necessarily the best way to go. Always look at your long-term capital plan and say, if we've got funding sources that'll pay for this and we're going to have enough reserves in the future, then that should sway our decision making a little bit more. So with that said, this bottom line, adding back amortization is 4.7 million, I want to say. 4.7 million and 4.4 million the year before. On this next schedule, we can see how much amortization is each year. So around 4.7 budgeted to 5 million over the last couple of years. Because this number is near break even with that $5 million included, you're essentially funding all of your amortization. This was similar to last year, where we're adding back amortization. We're coming up with a surplus of the $4.4 million versus 4.7. So if amortization wasn't in these numbers, and the powers that be let me put that number down here, which I would like to do, but can't, then that would be what your surplus before all this other stuff would be. So again, we hope that amortization is a perfect estimate, meaning that if it's $5 million each year, that number represents what you kind of should be reinvesting each year as part of your capital budget to keep your infrastructure at the same kind of state that it is year over year. So being that you're funding all of your amortization, that's what you're doing. So if amortization is a perfect estimate, which maybe it is, the town's doing well in funding all of it, basically all of it, less $380,000. That's also what we want to see when we're talking about how much we're funding each year. Sorry, I'm just going to jump to this statement really quick. If this number isn't changing too drastically each year, because this number goes up by how much additions you have in your capital budget each year, and then goes down by amortization. This is page 5. Right at the bottom here. So obviously with inflation, the costs of your assets, the costs of your infrastructure are always going to go up over time. But if you're funding all of your amortization and you're making those reinvestments that equal your amortization, this number shouldn't change all that much every year. It should just kind of grow with inflation, which is what we're seeing. So again, it's not the number be all and end all what you should be focusing on as far as your amortization and how it affects your budget and your actuals, but it's definitely positive indicators that you can look and say, we're funding basically almost all of our amortization through our bottom line. And our capital budget each year, the book value of our assets are just going up a little bit each year, meaning that we're making, if amortization is a perfect estimate, we're making that same kind of investment annually that we should be. So positive indicators, but again, not the be all and end all. As for how we arrive at this bottom line, you'll see we've got a rather large budget variance to the good. And this is coming from both expenses and revenues. And it's about a 50-50 split between two of them. So you've got positive budget variances on both sides. So one of the only positives about crazy inflation lately is that your return on investments, the rates are starting to recover. So rather than seeing a GIC at 0.4%, You can see GICs at 4 and 5. Same with bond yields and everything else. So this investment income spike we're seeing everywhere. So you're in line with all the other municipalities, probably a little bit better than some of them are, where if you're locked into long-term bonds, you're not going to see those increases right away until they mature. Whereas the town is holding notice on demand bank accounts. So the second the prime rate changes, the amount that you're earning for that month's interest in that bank account is changing right with it. So you probably did better than, in fact, from our clients, you did do better in terms of the increase in investment income. So that's a big amount of the over budget here. Also here. So sorry, there was a 4% increase on most of your main utility rates during the year. That's the 4% increase basically you're seeing here. This isn't all utilities, but mainly. So that's 4% you're seeing increase year over year and increase over budget, where budget was basically based on 2021. So now that we're kind of out of COVID, we're not expecting to see a lot of variance, at least between budget and actuals moving forward. Whereas the last couple of years, we've seen huge swings in the amounts of revenues with one-time special grant programs and huge swings in expenses where certain facilities or programs couldn't operate. So that's kind of gone away now for this fiscal 2022 year. So those are your main budget variances there. One working the opposite way is fines, where I understand your contractor just couldn't staff the contracted amount of hours or locations or however they measure those metrics. So it's not any other issue than just less money coming in because less fines are issued because less monitoring was done. As far as the expense side, again, it's contributing about 50% to this positive budget variance. This, as I said, is by function. It includes amortization, the much better schedule to look at your expenses. If you jump to page 13, this makes us list them by object instead of function, which allows us to separate this number out. Because again, when we're evaluating amortization, we're more worried about what our long-term capital plan looks like and how much we're funding of amortization. It's just an accounting entry. It's completely non-cash. So this nicely separates it out. So the main savings, salaries and wages. Now, as far as the admin turnover, that was basically offset within contracted. So the savings in the admin function basically just went down here. There wasn't really a whole bunch of savings that would impact your bottom line. So if CAO position 1 year is salaried, then the next year it's mainly contracted, then the next year it's salaried, you're going to see some differences there. But what we're looking at is expenses and how that's contributing to your bottom line. So it wasn't so much in those functions where you're seeing the salaries and wages. It was more in Parks and Rec and the library, if I remember correctly. Just with the vacancies within those functions where you wouldn't necessarily have big contracted expenses offsetting against that. So that's where the majority of your savings was. Mostly everything else is on or near budget. With this maybe being a budget error, I'd have to dig more into that. That's the better schedule I find to look at expenses, because again, it takes this out of the equation. Back to here. This is our main number. Again, without amortization, $4.7 million range. So because that's non-cash and just an accounting entry, if we look at the other statement, the main statement that we always look at, this is commonly known as your balance sheet. So a little bit different where this statement is 12 months. This is as at the last day of the year. What are your assets, liabilities? Who owes you money? Who do you owe money to? Because again, non-cash amortization in this number, $4.7 million surplus, even though that number is negative, your total cash And investments, where most of this ends up, the surplus ends up, goes up. Because again, amortization is completely non-cash. When we look at the accumulated surplus note, we can see better where the surplus is going into the individual reserves. But when you're looking at that number and it's negative, it's remember there's amortization in there. So we want to understand that these numbers can go up even if you're running a negative on the other statement. Accounts receivable. Is it West Fraser Mills, Shelby? I can't remember. Is that the right name? Yes. Their tax AR. They made a large payment right after December 31. So again, this is as of December 31. They owed you a lot more money than they usually do on their taxes, but they paid it right after year end. So it is collected. It's not, there's no worry about collecting that amount, but I understand they had some turnover in their own finance department and there was some confusion over how the monthly payments or lump sum payment would work. And so it was paid just after year end. So not any concern there, but in general, we don't want to see this number going up. We want to see it going down. That means you're doing a better job collecting the money that you owed and collecting it faster. So again, large payment after year end. Nothing to worry about there. So your total financial assets, 26 million. Again, we touched on this number, which is the net of your financial assets and your liabilities. As I said, this is commonly known as your balance sheet. If you've looked at other financial statements for a small business, for example, it would list all the assets at the top, not just the financial ones. So it would be all this stuff plus this stuff. It would get moved up here. And that would total to a number. And then it would take your liabilities down here and accumulated surplus, and it would add those together and it would total up to the same number. That's why it's called a balance sheet. It's a little bit better to understand that way, but the province wants us to organize this statement in this way because they want to see this number, which wouldn't otherwise be here, which is the net of what's kind of your liquid assets that is cash or near cash or could be cash soon. And your immediate liabilities, they want to know what the net is to kind of look at what your liquidity situation is. Some places this is negative. When you take on debt to fund capital assets, the capital asset goes down here, so it doesn't affect net financial, but the debt goes up here. So it does affect. So you take the hit for the debt you took on, but you don't get the benefit of the cost that you added. So that can flip this number negative. The fact that you're 11.4, now 14.218, it's one of those, again, not the be all end all of what the status of your financial position, but the province does care about this number and it's not without its merit. So the fact that it's positive, number one, is a good sign. The fact that it's increased, number two, is a good sign. And the fact that for a municipality your size, this would be a healthy number. If this number starts getting lower, then the province starts thinking there might be some issues. They might have to raise taxes or something because they don't really have enough assets to settle their liabilities if they had to. Kind of like a company when it's, they're starting to go into receivership or filing for bankruptcy, they would look at those kind of ratios. So another positive indicator. The common theme is, like we talked about last year at the town, there's a lot of positive indicators financially. It's not like there's a huge amount of extra surplus each year. You're kind of funding your amortization as you go. In terms of our clients, you're doing one of the better jobs in terms of budgeting and where your financials are at. As far as your liabilities, just a couple notes here. Again, this is as of the last day of the year. So if this number goes up, it could be a bad thing, but in your case, and in most cases, it's not. It's just the timing of the work that was being done around December. So you had more capital work being done around December, and those invoices being paid in January. So you would, as of December 31, you would count them as payable. There's also more construction holdbacks on the capital work this year, which gets included in this number. So it's more of a timing difference than anything. This deferred revenue, as we looked at in that note, this number isn't going to change, but the composition could. But the key takeaway is, in either case, this number is almost all MSI capital to be used in the future. Long-term debt didn't change much. Repayments, offset with the one new debenture this year. So still about 4.8 million. We'll look at this note. And this comes right off of the landfills financial statements. That's the consolidation portion. So the next note I would look at is this note 9, unless anyone had questions on this statement, excuse me.
Have Counselor Taylor.
Just to help me understand. Why is deferred revenue a liability? Like it's.
So it's money that-
we're getting from the grants.
Yeah, so it's grant money that you've received, but you haven't spent it yet. So you're essentially saving it up to use on a larger project in the future. Money you've received but haven't spent. So we show it as a liability because if you don't spend it ever, you would technically have to repay it. So that's why it shows as a liability. But that's the whole idea. It's the money that you've received. It's in your bank account. It just hasn't been spent on the eligible expense yet.
Mr. Telford, for the sake of time, do you want me to open it up for council, maybe to focus on any questions? Or is there another section that you wanted to cover?
I can just a couple notes I was going to run through quickly. So this accumulated surplus number 9. We talked about last year, this number was negative, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We like to see them all positive. So that is flipped, which is good. As a council motion, the final changes to these statements, you can move any part of this 918 into these two numbers if you so choose. If you show a number here, you're kind of telling the province, we don't have a plan for it because it's not in a reserve. So some places like to zero this out. This couldn't be done in prior years because the last few years this has been negative. So this is one thing we wanted to fix. But these numbers, these 3 numbers are the buckets that make up accumulated surplus that I talked about being liquid. So these offset in cash, investments, receivables, it's this big number that we separate out. That's tied up in your tangible capital assets, your roads, all your infrastructure. You can't really touch that. That's why they make it separate it out, because before, when we didn't, council might think they have this much money to spend. This is tied up in your assets. This is the money to spend as far as reserves. These 3 buckets being your operating capital and unrestricted. So you can move this down if you would like before we finalize these financial statements. I'll follow up with administration later to see if there's any changes to that. With that said, this number isn't so big that I think you're telling a bad story to the province. If this was $20 million, they might have questions for you. This note summarizes your debt. So again, this is another strong financial indicator. Province says this municipality could take on about 41.8 million before we start worrying about their liquidity. This is how much you have to date. This is how much room you have. This is less important. This is what you spend on your debt each year. That's the same kind of ratio they use. You'll see these 1.5 times revenue for this and 1/4 times revenue for operating revenue for this number. Those are kind of their metrics. They want this note in the statements to kind of say, are they near this threshold? That was the only 2 that I wanted to go through.
Okay, perfect. I have a few counselors in queue. I have Counselor LaBerge.
Thank you. So that $918,000 is part of that the surplus in these statements that aren't allocated to a reserve account. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Your surplus is going to run into, again, anything that has to do with capital assets is going to run into this fund. The rest of the surplus from operating is going to run into these 3 numbers. So it's just saying not all of your surplus has yet been transferred as reserve transfers right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor LaBerge. Counselor Haas.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And just to be clear, I caught, but I wanted just to confirm that 918,000, a couple of the large contributors to that surplus was the investments because they went up.
Yeah. So it's about 50-50 between your revenues and your expenses.
Okay.
And I think the investments, as far as the revenue side, was the majority
Right.
of that increase. So that is, it's one of the larger contributors overall.
And the other was on user fees and sales of goods. I
Yes.
saw there was, so that's the majority of where that 918 is coming from is we invest.
That's about half of it. That the revenue
half.
side is about half of it. And then you had expense savings within payroll, basically.
Okay,
That is the other half.
that's the other half.
Those are, they're pretty much 50-50.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Haas. Counselor Taylor.
So we talked about the 918. But because the net revenue before amortization of capital assets was 4.7, a lot of that net revenue has already gone into reserves. So we've made a contribution of over $3 million into reserves.
Yeah,
and
you're
we
up.
have 918,000 in an unrestricted surplus account.
Yes. And the impact there from year over year, it isn't that there's 918 because it took 800,000 to get it back to square. So the amount of the surplus that's hitting unrestricted is actually this number plus 800,000. So it's 1.7 is flipping this number from a negative to a positive.
So if we had reserves of 15.4 million last year, and we now have reserves of 18.5, we're up about 3.1.
Yeah.
So
And that's where the majority of that 4.7 surplus that we talked about without amortization, because that amortization is going into that equity and tangible capital assets fund. That's where the majority of that 4.7 is into specific operating and capital reserves, about 3 million and change. The other 1.7 is the amount that's flipping again, that negative 793 to now a positive 90.
Oh, I get it. Yeah, good explanation.
That makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Councillor Race.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess I want you to toot our horn. Us as a municipality, we have an accumulated surplus end of year of $167 million. Our debt in Hinton is less than $5,000.
5
million.
5 million,
5 million.
4.856.
And our reserves are sitting at 18 million. How do you feel about our little town?
Again, I think you asked a similar question last year, and I was kind of back and forth. As far as our clients are concerned, for municipality, your side, it's definitely on the positive side. But as auditors, we provide a report saying that these numbers are accurate. We don't like to, it's kind of like with the landfill. We don't like to get into, we can make recommendations, but we don't want to say, keep going the way you're going, because that gets into the decision-making process. What I would say to you is the province does reports every year that management can request that will line you up against all the municipalities that are your size and look over a whole bunch of different metrics and see where you fall. And that's one of the main documents that we always point our clients to, that you can at least see. It's a better comparison against municipalities your size to see where they're at and where you are in comparison. But from our clients, for municipality your size, you definitely have a lot more positive financial indicators in general.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Race. Councillor Taylor.
Our utility customers are getting charged a capital enhancement surcharge of roughly $16 to $20 per utility bill. Where's that reflected in the reserves? Or is there a special account that's going into it, or is it just thrown into like general reserves and not really?
Alicia, do you know a specific reserve offhand? It would be under here is my guess, but this might be several different individual GL accounts. So I don't know.
I may, through the chair, to all of council, the capital surcharge or the enhancement charge that is on the utility bills is totaled and balanced by administration, and it does flow into the excuse me, the water and sewer reserve.
It's tracked separately.
It's tracked separately to prepare for year-end audit. We have the working paper showing that what we have collected, and we're very careful to ensure that what we told citizens we're collecting is in fact going to reserves. But I can't say that there is, without looking at the GL for the past years, that there is no other monies have been added to this reserve.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Council, any other questions, directions? What would we like to do with this? Councillor Taylor.
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion with respect to the investment revenue surplus and just get some focused discussion going, if that's all right. Jen, I think I gave that to you. If you could put that up to me, please. Yeah, I'd like to direct administration to transfer 429,191. Can't read it now. Sorry, even with glasses. From the 2022 investment income surplus to offset the 2023 tax revenue. And that's that investment surplus that the auditor just talked about. So what I think is appropriate is that this unexpected return on investment of this amount of money should go to the people who paid for it, our taxpayers, hence offset the 2023 tax revenue, especially in these tough times of high inflation rates and rising costs. And what better way to help struggling families, seniors, and low-income folks than to reduce their taxes for next year by this significant amount with the return from their own money? And what better time to help taxpayers than right now, considering all our reserves have never been higher, our debt is relatively low, as Councillor Ray said. And further, as we've just heard, we're contributing a healthy amount of money to reserves. It's also worth mentioning that a local poll of over 72 people indicated that the majority thought that reducing taxes for 2023 was a good option. And even after doing this with that 918,000 unrestricted reserve, even after making this adjustment, we're still going to have $500,000 of surplus to deal with that we could use for RCMP backlog, we could use for any other thing. So anyways, I hope you look forward to your support for that. Thank you. One more. And with respect to the citizens of Hinton, I mean, even the Bank of Canada expects high inflation rates, and they're going to stay higher coming into the future. So this is going to just do nothing but help our citizens, high and low income, adjust to this burden going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Council, we have a motion on the floor. Any debate, questions, comments? What, Councillor LaBerge?
Thank you. I will speak in favor of this. Unlike things like positions that weren't filled and some of the other things that have led to this surplus, this is actually windfall returns on our savings account. And the savings account isn't ours, it's the taxpayers. And I think them recognizing benefit from that is a little bit different. And because this is, you know, in good conscience, we went to citizens the last time and said, here's a balanced budget. I think these numbers are fair. And I think now that we've sort of discovered things have gone better than we'd anticipated, that flowing back to citizens, I think is the right thing to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor LaBerge. Council, any further comments or debate? For myself, if there's no alternative, I'd support this. I would like to reduce taxation to a certain amount. I'd be more comfortable doing half of this amount towards taxation. Because if we would have had this information 3-4 months ago, the tax rate that we chose, or at least from my perspective, would have been different. It's information. But we also, on the other hand, have other information that we weren't really privy to 4 months ago, which is the policing agreement, waste cell construction. We did cut down the reserve contribution to offset taxation in the first place. So there are things on both sides. So for me, I would be more comfortable allocating half of this amount, lower the tax rate closer to 2%, which is compared to other municipalities, extremely low. And still have some of this money go into reserves, as this is a one-time off We don't know what these investments amount are going to be in 2024. And yet, if we don't increase our tax revenue at all this year, and the other variables aren't similar in 2024, we then have to increase taxes potentially at a higher amount. So I'd like to be a little bit more cautious in splitting this revenue. But again, if there's no appetite to have a lower amount, then I would support this worst case scenario for myself. Those are my thoughts. Thank you. Councillor Race.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To administration, I know it's hard to give a firm number, but would this look like a 3.5, 3.7 tax reduction?
Through the mayor to members of council, I have it a little closer to 3.2.
Okay.
Just in absence of having the exact number, but I believe it's right around 3.2 reduction.
Thank you very much. I will support this.
Thank you, Councillor Race. Councillor Haas.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm with the mayor on this. I do believe that some of this should flow back, but I think also too, it was an investment money, and I think we could use that to invest in other things that will in the future offset some things, whether it's reserves. You know, I realize that, you know, it leaves enough for potentially, you know, for the RCMP. But I think it's reasonable to based on comparing a lot of communities and their increases, is if we were to do this in half, bring it down to roughly about 2%, and then have a further discussion where the rest gets allocated. You know, I'm of the same mind as the mayor right now. So I'll hear what for the rest of council thinks, but I'm still thinking on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Haas. Council, any further debate, questions before I call this motion to question? Seeing none, we have a motion on the floor to direct administration to transfer $429,191 from the 2022 investment income surplus to offset the 2023 tax revenue. And we will now go to voting. And that is carried 5-1. Councillor Stashik against. Council, any further direction for this item? Administration, we would still need a motion to accept this presentation. I'm sorry, I'm just going to go to the recommended action. It would be as amended or as presented if there was a direction from council.
Through the mayor to members of council, yes, I believe that we can pass this as presented if council's comfortable with the audited financials.
Perfect, thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Yeah, I just don't know the order of things, but I'm just kind of wondering, with the unrestricted reserve of 918 and this taking it down, and still leaving $488,000. Was there an appetite for council directing administration to prepare a report or make some sort of direction on how we spend the remaining 488? I throw that out there as a discussion. I'm not going to make a motion, but I just want to hear what people say.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Council, any comments, questions? If not, any direction? How would we like to close out this item? Councillor Haas.
I guess I'll make a comment on the question and I'm okay with accepting this. I think we still have the 488,000 in the surplus. We have other matters on the agenda that could potentially become part of the conversation. Whether it's a direction to, you know, do something with it in regards to that, I don't know. But I'm comfortable with it because it's still an unrestricted, it's not going anywhere. We can still have that conversation in the future. That 488, those are my thoughts on it. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor Haas. Council. Again, any direction, Councillor Haas?
I'll make the direction that council adopt the town of Hinton draft 2022 consolidated financial statements as presented.
Thank you, Counselor Hawes. Council, any debate, questions, comments before I call this to voting? Counselor Hawes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Before voting, I just want to say, first of all, I mean, thanks to the auditor, but also to administration, it was a struggle last year, come a long ways, I believe, just based on the auditor's comments. The fact that we have increased our investments incomes to be able to utilize those funds for our citizens and possibly other expenses that come in the future as well. So, I do think that based on the auditor and stuff, we are doing well as a municipality, and to keep being financially responsible for that. So thank you to all. And I look forward to where that rest of that money will go. So thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Hawes. Counselor Race.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just one question. The $240,000 earmarked for the recreation construction fund, will that automatically go there now?
Through the mayor to the rest of council, I will turn that question over to Ms. Borbo.
Thank you, council. Excuse me. There was through budget time in 2022 allocations that were made by administration, so hence the changes in the funds. But there was 187,300 budgeted for specifically recreation center building. And there was also a major facilities fund that was budgeted as well, and that isn't necessarily designated to any one particular item at this time.
Okay, sorry. So does that mean funds are going into that, the rec center rebuild?
Through the chair, yes. So there are funds that were budgeted through. The 249,000 that you referred to isn't showing up, but I do see 187,300 going into rec center building. And then there is a major facilities reserve, which also was funded. Not being here at budget time last year, I can't speak to what happened to the 249,000 that you referred to, why that number changed.
Yeah, it was a 240,000. And that was a motion made last council that every year we would put 240,000 into that reserve. So I just want to, make sure that we continue to do that.
If I may, I will follow through and find that motion and ensure that it's documented in 2023, the budget coming forward.
Thanks a million.
Thank you, Counselor Race. Counselor Taylor.
Just to follow up to Counselor Race's question, page 23, notes to consolidated financial statement number 10, rec center construction 990,000. Is that where the money goes?
Administration, any comments?
Thank you. I'm just getting to that page number. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that page number on the reserve?
It's note number 6, restricted surplus. It's under capital reserves. It's page 23 or 27. I got 2 pages here. I don't know which one's which.
Thank you. I found it.
Pick which one you want. So this money that we're putting to reserves for the rec center, is that the sum right there?
That is correct.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Taylor. And Administration. Council, anything further before I call the motion to vote? Seeing none, we have a motion on the floor that council adopts Town of Hinton draft 2022 consolidated financial statements as presented, and we will go to voting. And that is carried unanimously. Council, Counselor Hawes.
Yeah, on the note of the topic of reserves, I guess maybe I might have misunderstood and you can clarify, administration. My understanding, because in the past, we had these conversations during the budget process. But my understanding is that we talked about what we wanted to put into reserve, but we're intending, the administration, I thought, was to intend to bring a report to where does council want that money to go into reserves? Is that still the plan? I know we have a motion about one particular reserve, but I'm just curious as to the rest, because that wasn't part of the conversation in the, like it was in the past. So am I correct or incorrect?
If I may, thank you, council. We did indicate that we would be bringing a plan forward in discussion with CAO Panasik. What we're wanting to bring forward is an actual reserve strategy for all of council. So rather than making one-off decisions here and there, we can bring the whole picture forward and present it and move forward from there in a very organized fashion.
Okay, if I may. No, I appreciate that. I mean, we've heard in the past of how having a policy on reserves, which we don't have. So that makes sense now to bring them both at the same time. So I appreciate that. So that's to come in 2023 to set us up for 2024 budget, I'm assuming.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hawes. Council, anything further for 6.1? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Telford, for your thorough information. We appreciate it and we look forward to seeing you next year. And with that, I'll call a 5-minute recess. We'll reconvene to finish our action items. Thank you. 8. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to reconvene this meeting at 5:28. That brings us to item 6.2, PA and speaker system in the Bill Thomson Arena, CO Panasik.
Thank you, Mayor. I will turn this item to Ms. Juke.
Thank you, through the chair to the rest of council. And we have Recreation Administrative Supervisor Heather Mark here to answer some questions as well if we have any detailed questions. The PA and sound system at the Bill Thomson Arena. This is a request for decision before council to decide whether or not to proceed with execution of a capital project to replace the PA sound system at the Bill Thomson Arena. As stated in the report, this project was provisionally approved as a capital project with a budget of $8,000 by council, with the direction to administration to return an RFD before spending any money. Council directed administration to, or administration recommended that we test the system to determine the causes of poor quality of sound in the arena and try a few options for improving the sound if the project, and before determining if the project was still warranted. So administration has done that. And to highlight one of the other actions that we've done, we did obtain a professional assessment of the sound system in the arena to determine, which determined that aged equipment worsened by poor orientation and installation, like directional, no longer produces sound satisfactory to arena patrons and ICE users, and hasn't for a number of years. A within budget option to replace the 3 speakers that are there that are aged, and the sound boards as well, was obtained and proposed is 6 amped speakers and a user-friendly sound mixing console. And the quote is presented on page 45 of your agenda. And for those interested, the proposed sound distribution layout is also attached to the agenda, pages 43 and 44. And with that, Supervisor Mark and I will take any questions that council might have.
Thank you, Ms. Juke. Council, any questions or directions for this item? What would we like to do with this today? Councillor Taylor.
Yeah, I'd like to go with the recommended option, please. Number 1. And that's that council direct administration execute the 2023 capital project to upgrade the PA and speaker system in the Bill Thomson Arena with a new system to a maximum cost $8,000. It's budgeted. It's a critical facility. We've got to have it working up to function, and we've had experts come in, and this is what they said we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Council, we have a motion on the floor. I have Councillor Hawes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll be in full support of this, and I want to appreciate Administration also jumping on this quickly. I know we were waiting till the ice was out to check on the system and see if we could make it work. And obviously, you know, with the recommendation, so I'm in full support of it, and we can then get it up before the next season. So that's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hawes. Council, we have a motion on the floor. Any further debate, questions? Seeing none, the motion is that council direct administration to execute the 2023 capital project to upgrade the PA and speaker system in the Bill Thomson Arena with a new system to a maximum cost of $8,000, and voting will be open. And that is carried unanimously. Council, anything further for this item? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Juki and administration. That'll bring us to 6.3, the Hinton Grant Funding Advisory Committee member appointment, CO Panasic.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I will pass this one off to Ms. Wade.
Thank you, CAO Panasic. Today, we need to decide who is going to fill the 5th chair for the Hinton Grant Fund Advisory Committee. That is the committee that makes up the board for the community grant. To stick to the timelines that have been presented for this year, we would need to fill the 5th seat today so that nothing gets postponed. We have 4 boards or council appointed boards that can be the 5th chair. 2 have members that have come forward that are able and willing to fill the 5th chair, and 2 of the boards did not have members that were able to come forward. There is an option to not fill the 5th seat with a board member, but have a citizen at large. However, this would cause delays for this intake and possibly the second intake. Any questions?
Thank you, Ms. Wade. Council, any questions or directions? What would we like to do with this item? Councillor Hawes.
So just a quick question to clarify. So the Hidden Youth Advisory Committee, Boardwalk Oversight Committee, those 2 boards have said, yes, we could provide, but policing and the Hinton Library said they're unable to.
Through the chair to Councillor Hawes. Yes, that is correct. The Beaver Boardwalk Oversight Committee has their primary member selected for the board and an alternate ready to go. And the same thing with the Hinton Youth Advisory Committee.
Okay. So if I may, Mr. Chair, I'd like to move that council appoint a member of the BBOC to the 5th seat of the Hinton Grant Fund Advisory Committee for 2023. Really no logic to, I mean, we have a youth already on the board. Sometimes their schedules are hard with school and everything, and I know they've got a lot going on. So I'm just thinking maybe for consistently having a BBOC member being that 5th chair would be great. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hawes. Council, we have a motion on the floor. Any debate, questions? Seeing none, the motion is that council appoint the Beaver Boardwalk Oversight Committee to the 5th seat of the Hinton Grant Fund Advisory Committee for 2023, and voting will commence. And that is carried unanimously. Council, any further action for 6.3? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Wade. And that'll bring us to 6.4, the Welcoming and Inclusive Community Policy, CO Panasic.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. The attached policy is being brought forward today for your direction. The purpose of the policy is to outline through the policy the town of Hinton's commitment to applying a lens of equity, diversity and inclusion towards the business conducted by the municipality, with a focus on accessibility, removing barriers to participation, and creating a welcoming community for everyone. The policy will also serve to align ourselves with the current senior levels of government. And with that, if there are any questions related to the policy, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you, CO Panasic. Council, any questions, directions for this item? From any counselor? Counselor Huss.
Yeah, I know we had good discussion during the whole meeting. There was some around the wording, but it sounded like it was in line with a lot of other, with both provincial and federal. So I'm going to move that council approves the welcoming and inclusive community policy AD 1201 as presented. And I mean, I don't think this changes our practice so much. It just now clarifies, it's a policy of our community, and that we follow that when administration is conducting business. So thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Hawes. Council, we have a motion on the floor and I have Counselor Race.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question to administration. 4.12 protective class. Is there a specific reason that is in there? I know that's a human rights, so.
Through the mayor to members of council, yes, that definition is consistent with the human rights legislation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Counselor Race. Counselor LaBerge.
Thank you. I've thought a lot about this and I'm very begrudgingly going to support this. This is something that I find is a big problem with government. And I don't know how much time's been spent in the preparation of this document, but the question was asked last time, what problem are we solving? And the question was nothing, and it probably isn't going to impact anything. But we've spent administration time and now council time to get to this. I guess if it helps us get a grant, great. But I really, the definition of a protected class, when really we should be talking about reasonable to treat all of our citizens reasonably, I think is our job. And so again, I will very begrudgingly support this. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor LaBerge. Council, Counselor Taylor.
I don't support it. I gave my reasons the last meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Taylor. Council, any further debate, questions? Seeing none, the motion that we have is that council approve the welcoming and inclusive community policy AD 1201 as presented, and voting will commence. And that is carried 5-1 with Counselor Taylor against. Council, anything further for 6.4? Seeing none, thank you, administration. That brings us to the cemetery fees bylaw 796-5, third reading. CO Panasic.
Thank you, Mayor. I will turn this one over to Mr. Scheffel.
Good evening, Mayor, through to all of council. Tonight, administration brings before you bylaw number 796-5, cemetery fee schedule A. This report was last before you at the April 4th, 2023 meeting of council, where council directed administration to change the fee schedule to have just one cost for burials all year instead of a prorated cost for winter versus summer. Council gave first and second readings to the bylaw that evening. Administration recommends that council give third and final reading to bylaw number 796-5, cemetery fee schedule A as presented.
Thank you, council. We have 6.5. Any questions, comments? What would we like to do with this item? Councilor LaBerge.
Thank you. I would like to move that council give third and final reading to bylaw number 796-5, cemetery fees schedule A as presented. And if I might, the one change that was made to this was to make the cost of a burial, whether it's a grave site or an urn, to be non-seasonable, which I think is fair. it's one of those really unfortunate things that happen to a family. And I really don't think it is fair that there's a different cost if it happens in the winter versus the summer. So I support it fully. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor LaBerge. Council, we have a motion on the floor. Councillor Taylor.
Yeah, I just have a question to understand what I'm voting on. I'll go back, the columbarium niche again, 1,700. The cost, that this thing cost in the first place, if I remember the last meeting was around 900, so that leaves 800 odd dollars for, various other things. And, it wasn't clear on what that $800 cost was. And I asked for clarification. I didn't get it, but, so how much do the plaques cost? I was told the plaques cost a lot of money. What exactly do the plaques cost?
Administration.
Through the mayor to Councillor Taylor. The costs that we used to calculate $1,700 were costs for the niche, the concrete pad costs, plaque costs, which are in the $500 range. Those go up and down depending on the details of, you know, how the plaque is purchased, if it's done prior to some of the burials. If there's two people going in and you have to get date plaques separately after the fact, then that increases the cost. If everything is done at once, it's a slightly lower cost. So an average cost of 500, plus there's staffing costs of around $360. Again, that's kind of an average based on how often people come in to meet with administration, as well as you also have the park staff time to go out and facilitate the burial or the columbarium access.
Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Administration, council, any further debate, questions for this item? Seeing none, the motion that we have on the floor is that council give third and final reading to bylaw 796-5 cemetery fee schedule A as presented, and voting is now open. And that is carried unanimously. Council, anything further for 6.5? Councillor Race.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do have one question, and I do not want to belabor this, but the working hours at the cemetery, I think it says in the document 9 to 2. Are those hours 9 to 2 so that once the service is over at 2 o'clock, that will allow our staff to prepare the site and close it?
Thank you. Through the chair to the rest of council. I'll have to check on the exact answer for that. Typically, the services in the cemetery are scheduled so that they're fully completed by the time that staff are completed their day's work. So I'll have to check and see if the 2 o'clock timeframe is for the service to be completed, or if that's the latest booking that a service can be made. I'll have to check on that and get back to council.
Yeah, I was thinking because I checked other municipalities and nobody's working hours in the cemetery stops at 2 o'clock. So I was thinking to ensure that our people, our employees, are not incurring overtime, that funerals, will end at 2 to allow for closing of the plot. So, all righty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Race. Council, anything further for 6.5? Seeing none, thank you, administration. That brings us to our second last action item for this afternoon, repurposing of capital funds, 6.6, CO Panasic.
Thank you, Mayor. I will turn this one over to Mr. McLaughlin.
Thank you, Council. We had a very good discussion on this topic at the committee of a whole. And since that discussion, we have changed our recommended action. So what we're requesting today is that you defer this project and just allow us to spend up to $50,000 engineering the project for next year. And the discussion on the CCTV cammering is still very important, but coming out of our conversation last time, the idea that we've come up with is to basically use the already $60,000 that's budgeted for this project, but do it as a sampling. So instead of just doing one long length of pipe and finding the problems in that specific sense, we will sort of sample all the old pipes in town, concentrating on making sure that you do some of each material type, some of each age group, some of each area. And then from there, we should be able to come up with at least some good estimates of where the problems are. The downside to doing this option is that once we select a project, we will have to actually do more CCTV work, because you'll actually have to do the entire length of pipe in order to properly design a repair or replacement. So it will result in us having to do more later, but that was always the plan to begin with.
Thank you, Mr. McLaughlin. Council, any questions or directions for 6.6? Councillor Hawes.
Sorry, I guess some clarity, Mr. McLaughlin. So what you're asking for, though, is to take to delay that asphalt resurfacing project, so that you take 50,000 to engineer it. And that, if I recall, was looking at different options to strengthen that particular area, especially around the jug handle there, where there's heavy traffic. So, because I think, was it prior, we were talking about doing the CCT reallocating. So that's changed. I just want to.
So really what we're asking for is in the 2023 budget, we have this $330,000 to repave a bit of Schweitzer, and we were concerned with both the pipes underneath the road possibly having damage by doing the project, as well as the current project was going to just mill and inlay some asphalt, and where the heavy logging trucks are, we think that we could do a better design and actually engineer a design that might have the concrete aprons and come up with a more long-term design, so that although it might be a more expensive project when we get into 2024, it'll be a better project, and that's why we're looking at this change.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hawes. Councillor Taylor.
So you're going to have inspected the Switzer asphalt pipes underground infrastructure before we proceed with like the pipes will have what do we call it? CCTV camera?
Yes, we'll still be proceeding with this year's CCTV project, which has $60,000 allotted, and we'll make real sure that we do this particular area as part of that project, along with sampling other areas.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Council, Councillor LaBerge.
Thank you. I would like to make a motion that council move to defer the Switzer asphalt resurfacing project to 2024 with up to $50,000 of the available $330,804 being spent to engineer the project in 2023. If I might, I think if it's more, but it's better, I think that's the right way to spend taxpayer dollar. And I'm happy that we're not going to take that $330,000 and try and spend it this year. I think this is the right way to go, and I hope I get support of my fellow councillors.
Thank you, Councillor LaBerge. Council, we have a motion on the floor. Any debate, questions? Seeing none, the motion is that council move to defer the Switzer asphalt resurfacing project to 2024 with up to 50,000 of the available 330,804 being spent to engineer the project in 2023. And voting is now open. And that is passed unanimously. Council, anything further for 6.6? Councillor Taylor.
Yeah, in Just this is the way I think, but in the future, I don't even mind a bigger CCTV budget. I just would like it, if it's going to be a bigger budget, I just would like it considered with all our other budget priorities, so we can see, we can have a broader look at what we're spending money on. That's all. But I think it's a good way to spend money to try to understand this underground infrastructure. I just need to look at all the priorities together. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Council, anything further for 6.6? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. McLaughlin. That brings us to our last action item, which is the RCMP retroactive costs. CEO Panasic.
Thank you, Mayor, to the rest of council. So as council's aware, on March 30th, Public Safety Canada sent administration a letter indicating that the federal government has made their decision in regards to the retroactive costs stemming from a collective bargaining process from 2017 to March of 2021. The result of that decision by the federal government to pass along those costs to municipality will affect the town of Hinton to the tune of $536,508.25. Public Safety Canada has also indicated that they will allow up to 2 years to pay. Since the last report, one other advocacy item that has been brought forward was the idea of a possible legal challenge. Alberta municipalities have explored the feasibility of a legal challenge. They commissioned an opinion from Reynolds, Mirth, Richards, and Farmer on whether RCMP retroactive salary increases can be charged to the municipalities under the terms of the municipal police servicing agreement. And the opinion indicated that there is a compelling argument for retroactive pay not being appropriate under the agreements. However, there's still a high risk that such a argument would not be successful if the matter were to be solved judiciously. As differing interpretations of the relevant clauses in the agreement would lead to different outcomes. The legal opinion therefore recommends that any dispute proceed under the alternative dispute resolution process. As a result, Alberta municipalities has shied away from an organized legal challenge on this item. They don't want to use their members' money on something that they don't believe or believe that there is a high chance of this being unsuccessful. The other item that is being brought forward today is specific to council's wishes on how to fund this. We do have up to 2 years to pay. We are recommending at this time that council directs administration to pursue the maximum allotted time for repayment through Public Safety Canada, which would be the deadline of March of 2025. And that council directs administration to budget the RCMP retroactive costs through a dedicated reserve to be funded by targeted and temporary tax rate increase of 1.86 for 2024 and 2025, subject to budgetary approval and acceptance of payment terms from Public Safety Canada. I will also not include it in this report, but I think it is a worthwhile discussion to have. This report was produced prior to us receiving the audited financials. But another alternative for council to consider would be that council simply direct administration to transfer the full 536,508 and 25 cents from unrestricted reserves to a new restricted reserve specifically for RCMP retroactive costs, and that would be funded from the unrestricted surplus that we have we see from 2022.
Thank you, CEO Panasic. Council. Councillor Race.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So if we chose that option to put that money into a restricted reserve, could we put it into a investment portfolio? So we're making some money while we're saving this money?
Through the mayor, yes, all of our restricted reserves are invested. So any revenue that derives from that would make up part of our general revenue, and that can be distributed to the other reserve accounts as needed.
Okay, good. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councillor Ray's. Councillor Hawes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a motion. Ms. Campbell, Davy Campbell. I'd like to council direct administration to allocate the remaining 2022 surplus to be invested for the period of 2 years which is the maximum allotted time allowed to pay for the RCMP retroactive costs. I guess or I'll wait till she's done. Pardon me, I guess invested into an allocated reserve account. Is that administration? Is that what I heard?
Yes, to the mayor, I would prefer dedicated.
Dedicated, okay.
Dedicated reserve account.
To dedicate the remaining 2022 to a reserve account. Dedicated to the remaining 2022 surplus to a reserve. I think that should do it. Unless administration sees anything.
Through the mayor to Councillor Hawes, my only other suggestion on this one might be to eliminate the 2 years and just simply have the maximum allotted time. And the only reason for that is we will certainly be going for the full 2 years. Just early indications, there's a little bit of pushback from Public Safety Canada on paying everything in 2025. And so I can't say for certain where that'll end up, but we know as long as our direction is to hold off for as long as we possibly can, we'll just make sure that we're not in contravention of the motion that's being put forward.
Yeah, so yeah, if you could just move that. Yeah. Right. Maybe speak to it. I mean, this is it's an expense that it's coming down. I don't believe it should be following our taxpayers' increased tax rate to compensate for it. We did have a surplus. We've already now reduced our taxes with this surplus. You know, we did put investments in. This is an opportunity. It's an unexpected cost, but I believe this is the best thing we can do. We can invest into it, make some money potentially off of it and pay that bill. So that's, I guess, again, we'll see how the rest of council feels. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hawes. Council, we have a motion on the floor. I have Councillor Taylor.
I don't know who to ask this question to. A question and a comment. So after we allocated the other money from the unrestricted surplus, we had $488,000. I guess you're thinking, Councillor Hawes, would be that the interest on this over a couple of years would more than make up for what we owe, probably.
Councillor Hawes.
That's my hope. Would you know, see where we're at in 2 years and the investment on it, and then have that conversation for the remainder if there is any. But yeah, that's where my thought is.
And the other, just a comment would be that as we are all aware, the budgeted amount for investment revenue for 2023 has now gone up by about $170,000. That projection has changed, so it might even be higher. So that's something in our favor for next year as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Taylor. Counselor LaBerge.
Thank you. Quick question. So have we found in certainty then that this is going to be interest free?
Through the mayor to members of council, yes, this is interest free.
Okay, great, thanks. So I was originally, and this is why I guess I got to slow down and listen till it's done. I wasn't initially going to be in favor because there's another potential option here that we haven't talked about, and that's to actually borrow the money. We have now used a big chunk of that surplus for tax reduction. And I think at a future point in time, we might find that there's a better use for that money. And I think looking potentially to borrow this and spread it out over more than 2 years might be an efficient way to move forward, given our low borrowing. Thanks.
Thank you, Counselor LaBerge. Counselor Stashik.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So yeah, my question was about what was left in the surplus and where the balance would come from. But so I do have a question. I heard some comments from councillors indicating that interest made on that initial investment would likely cover the rest of it. But my understanding is that interest accrued on the investment doesn't go to individual reserves. It just goes into a general interest account. I've looked to administration for confirmation of that. And if that is the case, how that may be managed to direct the interest to the dedicated reserve.
Thank you to the mayor, and I will allow Ms. Borbeau to supplement whatever I say, but we do know the amount of revenue that we are receiving through our investments. So we can simply divert that revenue towards this item as per a motion of council. That would be more of a manual function, and that would be done. And that's a big reason for the dedicated reserve account, because it's transparent and we can ensure that that money is there and the proper amount of money is being contributed towards that dollar figure. Ms. Barbeau, if there's anything else that you want to add.
Through the mayor to all of council, excuse me, we do, while the fund comes in and is lumped under investment income, we do go through an exercise to allocate to the individual reserves so that there's growth on those monies. Part of it is we have to report any interest that we've generated on the deferred revenue for monies from the province. So we do have a good tracking of the interest that each of these reserves grew by this year, or the amount that they grew by, how much of that is interest.
I could follow up, Mr. Mayor. So then I guess to administration, then would it just be a given that the interest would be applied to this? Or I believe I heard CEO Panasic indicate a motion of council that the interest should be applied to this dedicated reserve. Would that be an amendment to this motion, or is that a separate motion? How would that be handled?
Through the mayor to members of council, as a sake of clarity, I think a motion in this case would be appropriate.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Stashik. Council, we have a motion on the floor. Any further debate, questions on this motion? Counselor Stashik.
Thank you again, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, before it gets called to question, I just want to circle back to something Councillor LaBerge says, because I agree with him and I think it has value. I think the fact that we quickly made a decision earlier in the meeting to dedicate a large portion of that surplus to taxation savings without giving much conversation or much thought to the fact that we reduced reserve contributions during budget deliberations and didn't use any portion of this surplus to replenish those reserve contributions. Maybe this is the opportunity to use some of that leftover reserve to replenish those reserve contributions, and then take a look at maybe funding the retroactive pay in 2 years when and if it comes through either taxation or through borrowing, as Councillor LaBerge suggested. Anyway, just something to think about, talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stashik. Council. Councillor LaBerge.
Okay, here's the rookie counselor question then, because I haven't been through this. So that being a dedicated reserve, that money could, the decision could be made in 2 years to borrow the money and then to reallocate that then to another reserve account. Is that correct?
Through the mayor, yes. So any time that we actually release the money for this purpose or any other one, that'll have to be done by council through the budget process. So you will have to approve that expenditure through the 2025 budget, assuming that we get that far with Public Safety Canada.
Thank you, Councillor LaBerge. Councillor Hawes.
So thank you. That's a great question, Councilor Labarge, because it doesn't then that we have to do this, but the fact that we put it as RCMP retroactive cost then in the future is not, if we decide to do differently, that's appropriate. We can do that.
Through the mayor, yeah, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hawes. Council, any further debate, questions? Councillor Race.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So CAO, so today we really don't have to do anything. We have 2 years to do something. And this money will, or this money will make us money while that 2 years passes, eh?
Through the mayor to members of council, that is correct. We don't have to do anything with this now. And in fact, we're recommending that we don't pay this based on the original invoice date of 45 days, but that we wait the 2 years. We have a dedicated reserve with money in it. So to make sure in 2 years, we have the money available in order to pay the invoice. But as it was mentioned before, other options may come available in 2 years. We can have a more fulsome discussion based on in 2020 for the 2025 budget process as to what is the most appropriate way to pay that. So I'm happy with the motion as put forward. I think I would support that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councillor Race. Councillor Hawes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So thank you to Councilor Labarge I don't disagree with the fact that maybe borrowing it would be, and I was almost to the point where I might pull it and then have that conversation. But the fact that we're putting it in there, it's in the reserve, it's not being utilized, it will pull investment in there. We'll see where we're at in 2 years, and if borrowing is a better option and we leave this in reserve, then so be it. But if we then decide to use this reserve, I see Ms. Barbeau is ready to pull the trigger, so maybe I'm wrong. So go ahead. Sorry.
My apologies to all of council. I do not believe borrowing would be an option for this RCMP money, as it's stated in the MGA that you can borrow for capital, but not for operating costs. So just point of clarity, we will look into it further when we get closer to paying that, if that's the wish of council.
Thank you, Councillor Hawes. Council. Any further debate or questions before I call this to question? Seeing none, the motion that we have on the floor is that council direct administration to dedicate the remaining 2022 surplus to a reserve account to be invested for a maximum allotted time to pay for the RCMP retroactive costs, and voting is now open. That is carried unanimously. Council, what would we like to do further? Councillor LaBerge.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I think that the administration wanted to have attachment 1 be part of our approvals tonight. So I'd like to move option 1, that council approve the resolution prioritizing municipal input in future RCMP contract policing decisions as set out in attachment 1.
Thank you, Councillor LaBerge. Council, we have a motion on the floor, which is the first recommended action. For any further debate, questions, comments? Councillor Hawes.
Yeah, just quick. I'm in full support of this. I think we need, they're already in negotiations for the next one. So I think we need the AM has to pull the trigger on this one quickly. So I'm full support of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hawes. Council, any further debate, questions, comments? The motion that we have is that council approve the resolution prioritizing municipal input in future RCMP contract policing decisions as set out in attachment 1, and voting is now open. And that is carried unanimously. Council, anything further for this item? Councillor Stashik?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just housekeeping, circle back to the request from CAO Panasik that there be a motion from council regarding interest generated from that investment. I'd like to move that any interest generated from the, sorry, I forget the name of it, the dedicated RCMP retroactive pay reserve. Be reinvested back into the reserve. Good. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think we've already spoken about it.
Thank you, Councillor Stashik. Council, we have a motion on the floor. Any debate, questions? If none, we will open voting. And that is carried unanimously. Council, anything further for this item? Councillor LaBerge.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A question, I guess. And I don't imagine the MGA is really flexible on things, but I've got to think we're in a pretty healthy financial situation here in Hinton, but there's going to be lots of communities where paying that retroactive bill is going to be a problem. And is there any opportunity to have the discussion with the government to see if a special provision could be put for the borrowing of this amount particularly? Is that a discussion? Is there any back and forth that ever happens with governments to see if, given the unique nature of this charge, that would be something they would consider?
Through the mayor to members of council, I certainly think, Ms. Bourbeau is correct. But I also do believe that there is some room on this potentially to borrow for. And I would assume that this would likely require ministerial approval to borrow for this purpose if we are to go outside of the MGA. But given that this is an advocacy item, that I think that the provincial government would likely be in support of, there's certainly a possibility. I won't close the door completely, but as of today, typically municipalities do not borrow for operating costs, but I wouldn't close the door on that option completely.
Okay, as a follow-up then, what would be the process to have that discussion go forward?
Through the mayor to member of council, coming up to the 2025 budget, or I would say partway through 2024 or early 2024, I think it would be wise for council to start advocating on behalf of the town if that is the payment option that we did want to pursue. I would think that would be a political advocacy item.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor LaBerge. Council, anything further for this action item? Councillor Stashik.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm pretty sure that this is covered, but I just wanted to make sure that administration is good with the previous motion that was made by Councillor Haas, that item 2 in the options is covered, that council does want to take the maximum amount of time to pay this back.
Through the mayor to members of council, yes, I believe the original motion covered council's position on taking the maximum allotted time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stashik. Council, anything further for 6.7? Seeing none. That'll bring us to our correspondence for this evening. Councillor Hawes.
Thank you. In regards to the correspondence, I just want some clarity. We had a minute with council come with the 7.1 for draft 2023 homelessness resolution. Is it the intent? Is Rocky Mountain House looking for a seconder on this? Is this the reason it's in our package, or what is the intent?
Through the mayor to members of council. No, I don't believe that there's any action being sought from Rocky Mountain House on this particular item right now. This was simply a resolution put forward by one of the communities, and they had sent it to all of the other communities, so they're aware of it ahead of time and requesting there's board council support on this particular item. So we just figured that we would include it into the package for council's information.
Okay, well, thank you. I just didn't know if they needed a direction on this, because quite frankly, I mean, I am in support of this, and and I look forward to it at AM conference to see where it goes, but thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hawes. Council, any other questions for correspondence? If not, I'll entertain a motion to accept them for information. Councillor Hawes.
Yeah, I'll accept the correspondence as information.
Thank you, Councillor Hawes. Council, we have a motion on the floor. Any further questions? Seeing none, we will open voting. That is carried unanimously. That'll bring us to our notices of motions. Any notice of motion this evening? Seeing none, that'll bring us to our information item for this evening, and we have one proclamation. 24 million Canadians give their time through formal or informal types of volunteering, contributing close to 5 billion volunteer hours per year. Volunteers in Hinton mentor our children, support those feeling isolated, beautify our green spaces, and fundraise for our charitable organizations. Volunteers in Hinton have stepped up to support families, friends, neighbors, and strangers, people standing up to systemic racism, and people sharing insights on how to create a more just and equitable society. Hinton's volunteers are individuals, families, workers, retirees, community members of all ages and backgrounds. Groups in this area of sports and recreation, health and wellness, human and social services, arts and culture, environmental, seniors and youth community associations, service clubs, churches, and so much more. The collective result of the work done by our town's volunteers is that Hinton is a more desirable place to live. Therefore, I, Marcel Michaels, Mayor of Hinton, do hereby proclaim April 16th to the 22nd of 2023 as National Volunteer Week, and urge my fellow citizens to recognize the crucial role played by volunteers in our community. And I've said this before, let's continue to encourage our youth and other age categories to step up for those. We again and again see many of the same volunteers in our community and other communities who do all the work, and we have to bring that expectation, that encouragement, and ask people. And I'm glad to see that tonight there is the volunteer fair here in our community, and I hope to see that every year, where you get to go meet groups that are looking for volunteers and see if it's a good fit for you. So I'm happy for that. And again, it's upon all of us to put that effort in to increase those volunteers, as they won't be able to do it forever. So let's make the next generation just as strong as this one that we have currently. That will bring us to our reporting for this evening, and I will start to my right with Councillor Taylor.
I went to the Waste Authority meeting the other day, and they delivered a report on the activities, and we talked about the budget. And one discussion item that was kind of interesting was that there will be a future sell quite a few years into the future. So we're talking about how to raise money for that with maybe fee increases, so that municipalities don't get stuck with a big cash outlay that 5-10 years in the future. And they talked a little bit about trespass and stolen bulldozers and things like that. So it was kind of interesting. The contractor bulldozer was stolen and taken off, but it's covered by insurance. So there are trespassers that do come on the property to take stuff off. And then my question was, how do they go after your information? Like when you throw stuff in the garbage and you throw away information on your finances, say in the garbage, are they going after that? And they weren't clear on whether that was happening, but that's kind of a caution to make sure that when you throw financial information away, you make sure that it's shredded or destroyed pretty good. Because there are people that are getting into our garbage and you just don't know what's going to happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Councillor Race.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've spent the last 2 days at a municipal ethics leadership workshop. I think I'm going to find it very hard to say in one paragraph how beneficial that these 2 days have been. Very informative, good information on communication. He really stressed when to talk and when to listen. Also, the importance of listening and asking questions for clarity. Met some great people, CAOs, counselors, clerks. It was really beneficial. And Thursday, Friday, I attend again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councillor Race. Councillor LaBerge.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Nothing to report.
Thank you, Councillor LaBerge. We'll move over to Councillor Stashik.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have nothing to report either.
Thank you, Councillor Stashik and Councillor Haas.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too attended the Bloom Municipal Leadership Workshop. Took a lot from it. I look forward to sharing the more information with the rest of council and administration as well, I hope. And as Councillor Reese said, I'm also attending the Municipal Mastery for elected officials coming Thursday, Friday in Jasper. Not only the same person delivering it, but we're also getting the experience of 26 years of a counselor in Spruce Grove as well, joining the conversation for the next 2 days. And I'm looking forward to what they have to share as well. If it's, I think, even going to be better than the first 2 days. So one thing I do want to say, though, for us, what I learned a lot about the last 2 days is we are doing, I believe, to be a great job as a municipality in a lot of different ways, from our strategic plan, the tactical plan, which by the way, the administration and councils that were present, that is a practice that isn't commonly done. So we are definitely on the right track for that. So there's a lot of great things happening in our municipality that, we learned a lot and to keep doing. So I look forward to sharing that. I also just want to plug again, tonight, right now at the Path is the volunteer fair from 6 to 8. So I really do encourage people, because as Mayor Michael said, volunteers is what is the backbone to a lot of the organizations and the events that happen. And knowing what they do and the benefit that you could bring possibly to those groups and to take some of the workload off of them. We have the sign up nights in September for those. That's the groups that have those volunteers. So the more the help, the better. So please check that out for those that are listening. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Haas. I wasn't able to attend the waste management meeting as Councillor Haas was preoccupied also, but Councillor Taylor did represent our community. So that's good. What I was at was our FCSS regional meeting, which one big section was governance. And we had 3 regions that weren't present. So we talked about facilitating virtual events, but also making the day, the spring session is an important one, where we don't meet again until the AGM happens in the fall. So the conversation was catered around working together regionally to bring forward resolutions for the fall meeting, almost kind of making it a bit more organized, these meetings within regions. We do updates where our community, Hinton, is pretty much doing what every other community is doing. Then sort of communicated some of the concerns we've talked about with FCSS in this, not concerns specific to FCSS, but opportunities. What are we not doing with FCSS when it comes to things that the province might be overlooking? So a lot more formality, I believe, will be coming to these regional meetings. And again, I encourage council as board members to attend the spring session in 2024, where we can have an impact on where we want the government of Alberta to allocate these funds and perhaps not download things, but obviously push for these resolutions as we do with AB munis, et cetera, kind of, doing a better job at a FCSS level, especially collectively, because the region is 6 members around who get together quarterly. So it's an important group. And that is all for myself. CEO Panasic.
Thank you, Mayor. Nothing to report this time.
Thank you, CEO Panasic. And with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Councillor LaBerge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we adjourn.
Thank you, Councillor LaBerge. Administration, are we voting electronically for this? For adjournment? Okay, all those in favor? That is passed unanimously. Thank you very much, everyone.